Chapter 13. I sighed and slapped my hands down on the kitchen table. "I need a break," I said, and stood. William put down his pen. "How were your grades in school?" he asked as I made my way to the living room. "Terrible," I said. "Just a moment." I grabbed the heavy fur blanket from the back of an old rocking chair and returned to the kitchen table, pulling it over my shoulders. I was too busy fighting the war in the jungles of southern China to think about school. I used music to escape, music to feel something aside from the hate, and spent most of my time in the other worlds when I wasn't being used as Joe's plaything. Already I had learned to shut down and control my emotions. I remember the day Pissant cheated on me. I slipped into one of my worlds where I stayed for 3 hours. I knew it was 3 hours because when I came back, my cousin had told me how long I'd laid on her bed, staring at the wall, not blinking. When I came to, I was smiling and joking as if the world was right. Her boyfriend was there. I took off my pants and sat on the bed in my thigh-length shirt and panties. I just wanted to be comfortable. I didn't think anything of it. The girl in charge of watching us came in and screamed at me. I put my clothes back on. I remember feeling very little. No, I had felt nothing. Nothing. By the time I started that 6-month stretch with Joe, my emotions had been sealed. There was very little outside of joy that I permitted myself to feel. Jealousy, anger, hate, rage, fear, sorrow, grief. These were weak emotions to me. These were emotions I couldn't afford to feel. I did my best to seal them away and bury them. William removed the pencil tip from his mouth. Where were Hosea and Alona in all this? Hosea was there, always watching, always silent, always smiling, always supportive, and always nothing more, I said. Elena and I hung out between classes. Now and then I would escape the hell and enter the nirvana that was her home. I couldn't leave my own home often, or for very long, because leaving meant I left my cats at the mercy of Sean. My cats were the only reason why I didn't try and run away again. Again? William asked. I nodded. There was so much to say I worried about getting all the points in there. I decided to fit them in where I could while I was still talking. When I was 8, I packed my bags and left in the dead of winter. I made it to the farmhouse 5 miles down the road when I called my parents. I was yelled at, scolded, and openly ridiculed for leaving. My mother wanted to know why I left, and I refused to tell her it was because I felt unloved and unwanted. I refused to open up or talk to them. I would only be mocked, scolded, and ridiculed. I sighed and let my head fall into the back of the chair. My mother was the kind of person who denied any emotion, any belief, any truth, if she didn't agree with it. She'd already made it clear there was no love or empathy in her heart. Children should be seen and not heard. I loathed that proverb. I was raised on it. So I said nothing. She was unsatisfied with my silence. When I said nothing, she made up a lie and insisted that was the reason for my runaway. I think she was embarrassed that she had to run away for a daughter. She then told everyone in the family her lie, and everyone believed her. Everyone laughed, and my mother was their leader. To this day, my siblings believe her lie over my truth. It is so old that they have no idea they were fooled by her lie. William creased his brow in question. What was her lie? I stared across the table, not bothering to hide my contempt. I've lived in the shadow of that lie since I was 8. My mother would present my one-time attempted runaway to the family as an amusing anecdote at reunions. My siblings soon followed her example. To this day, they bring it up and laugh at my expense. I will tell you how I was raped and beaten. I will tell you how fucked up and psychotic I am. I will tell you any truth you wish to know. I will not tell you her lies. I tried to run away once. I never ran away again. My cats needed me to protect them. The first 3 months of officially dating Joe were spent with our parents practicing the child exchange. My mother dropped me off at Joe's house. Joe's father, Jake, dropped Joe off at the ranch. Joe and I would go to my room and fuck. Jake was a light in the dark for me. Joe had spoken of me often to his father. I remember the very day I met Jake. I'd walked to Joe's house and Jake came home from work. I was 15. Jake looked miserable. I loved Jake, but I won't lie. Jake was miserable then. He had no girlfriend, no wife, paid an insane amount of child support. That left him impoverished and worked a day job that sucked the life from him. "Mrs. Beth," Joe said. Jake gazed at me as if he had just shot up with a dose of exhaustion and misery. "Okay," he said. Joe rattled off something neither Jake or I listened to when the sudden light turned on in Jake's eyes. "Wait," he said. "This is Beth?" "Yeah," Joe said. "The Elizabeth," Jake said. "Yes!" "Oh, girl," he said to me. "You and I, we're going to have a talk right now." Right there, Jake sat me down on the couch in the living room, and for the next 5 hours he talked to me about drugs, sex, and rock and roll, everything a parent should have said to me. Within 5 minutes into the conversation, I was enamored with a man who had become like a father to me. By midsummer, Joe and I fell into the routine of weekly visits, sometimes up to 3 times a week. Jake dropped Joe off and left, or my mom dropped me off at Joe's and left. One day, Jake dropped Joe off like any other. Joe and I went to my room and fucked. When we were done, we emerged to find our parents sitting on the porch talking. Jake had never left. Joe and I hung out, had sex again, went back a few hours later. Our parents were still talking. For the next 2 weeks, my mother was more than eager to drive me to Joe's house at every chance she had. At his place, Joe and I went upstairs, had sex, and when we came back downstairs, my mother was still there. One afternoon, we came downstairs and found my mother buttoning her shirt. Jake had the widest grin on his face. Soon after, my mother was asking if I wanted to go to Joe's, even on days Joe and I hadn't made any plans. I'd consent. My mother would drive us over and leave for a walk with Jake. After a couple of weeks of this, my mother pulled me aside. "Don't tell your father." "Right. Don't tell my father. 'Cause he's on my side when Sean beats me." "Right. Neither was she, for that matter. I wasn't involved. I had no sides. No one was on my side. I was on no one's side, and I sought to do no one any favors. I stayed out of it. After a month of this, Mom drove me into town to drop me off at Joe's when they spotted Jake's truck outside the local diner. "Is that their truck?" Mom asked. "It is," I said. She pulled over, parked the car, and we went in. I sat beside Joe while my mom slid down beside Jake. While my mom and I waited for them to finish their dinner, my father showed up at the table. Apparently, my mother was in the middle of groping Jake. My father lashed out, confronted her right there. When she didn't give him the answers he wanted, he looked at me. "And you knew about this?" he asked. He looked at me with such hate. I threw my hands up. "I'm staying out of this." I loathed him for dragging a child into it. I detested them for shouldering me with such crap. If my father hated me before, it was nothing compared to how he looked at me that day. Later, my father would go on to tell me he blamed me for his marriage falling apart. My father reserved a special hate for me after that day. He looked back at my mother. They argued. I wanted to shrivel up and die. I tuned out their argument, but zoned back in to hear the end of it. "If you're going to do this, then get out," my father said to Mom. "Come to the house, get your shit, and get out." My father never swore. I watched him leave the diner. Jake threw down his dinner, and the race began. They called Joe's uncles, and within 30 minutes, Jake and my mother showed up on the ranch with 2 pickup trucks. To Joe, it was a looter's party. He and his uncles cleared everything out, stripped the place clean. My father sat on the back porch facing the forest while they ransacked the house. I stole a quick glance at the shell of a man too broken to care if they left anything. They took cookware, movies, everything along with all my mother's possessions, and a good portion of my father's things. Last but not least, my mother grabbed Eugene and Marie, and ordered them to pack their bags. Sobbing, my siblings collected their things without so much as an explanation from my mother. Charles went out and sat with my father. They shared a pack of cigarettes. For my mother, the event meant she was running off with her lover and riding out into the sunset. For Joe and Jake, their girlfriends moving in with them. For my father, his life, everything he'd worked for was stripped from him. For Sean, I think he was thrilled for the breakup. My mother was the woman who took his father from him and his own mother. For Charles, he witnessed my mother rip the still-beating heart from my father. For Eugene and Marie, they were uprooted, ripped from their home, taken from their father, shipped off to a house they'd never seen, and sent to live with strangers. For me, the experience was like no other. I stripped my room, collected my cats, and welcomed the end of my war. I was leaving Sean. The daily threats, the beatings. My cats were leaving the daily torture session they lived with, and the abuse. I was taking them to a place where they could never be hurt again. I could not run fast enough. I slung my guns over my shoulder, sheathed my swords, took up my cats, loaded my bow, and donned my fatigues and war paint for the last time. For me, I was getting the hell out of Vietnam. That first night, I lay in a bed in the upstairs room next to Joe's. I could hear Marie and Eugene crying downstairs, loud and long all night. My mother slept soundly next to Jake in her room. As usual, she ignored the cries. My heart hurt for my siblings. They didn't understand. They didn't know. They were children. They couldn't possibly understand what was going on. Marie was 13 years old. Eugene was 8. How old are you? How old were you? William asked as I nursed a small fire within the fireplace. The dampness in the air had finally pushed me to start a fire. I was 16, I said after a moment, and strategically layered the peat logs onto the tinder and growing fire. Charles had just turned 18. Had he stayed with your dad? My father, I said. Yes. The fire took off and I pulled my blanket around my shoulders. Why did Charles stay? William asked. I sighed, remembering the years of events I'd reviewed with my siblings. My brother had an unusual experience with my mother, I said. I stared into the fire and watched the flames lick the air. About 2 months before all this went down, he found her sleeping with another man. You mean Jake? William asked. Not Jake, I said. Wait. I heard William scoot his chair. Your mother was sleeping with Jake, your father, and a third man, I said. Yes, at the same time. William scoffed in disbelief, leaving me to continue. That day, Charles went off, smoked a pack of cigarettes, and when he got back, he confronted her. My mother denied everything. As I said, if she didn't like it, she denied it. What happened? William asked. I don't know the details, I said, settling myself back to the table. I was too busy surviving the jungle to pay attention to the opposing sides of the war. What little I know, my father told me about. My father went through the courts and got Eugene and Marie back almost right away. I think they stayed with Jake and my mom for a total of 2 nights, maybe. My father sought out counseling for himself and my siblings. What about you? William asked. I threw my head back and laughed. William stared intently at me. I went to counseling, I said, still chuckling. I fucked with him. You fucked with him. I wasn't stupid, I said. I slipped in and out of worlds that weren't there. I wrote letters to fictitious characters. I was passing into catatonic states more times than not. It required a concentrated amount of effort to keep myself here in this world. I was a runaway. I tried to slit my wrists. I was clinical, and I knew how to hide my condition. My father wasn't wrong. I was smart. I had read up on psychology in my encyclopedia set. I knew the words they would use, the signs they looked for. I knew everything they would ask me and why. I danced with them and played their game. I smiled and dished it back. They were charmed, delighted. I walked away a clean bill of health. Why didn't you let them help you? William asked, no longer the interviewer before me, but a concerned friend. I saw worry, concern in his eyes, and I felt anger. They could have helped you, he said. Helped me? I scoffed and felt the venom flow from me, and I thought I was delusional. He paid no mind to my passive-aggressive wit. There are clinics, medicines. I told them what my half-brother did to me, I said. When I was 13 and my half-brother was beating me, my parents shoved me into therapy to fix me. When I told them what my half-brother did to me, my mother lied her ass off to protect Sean. My mother danced her dance and gave her finest performance. She convinced the therapist that I was a chronic liar. I was punished by my parents, and the therapist threw out my testament. They believed my mother over me. 2 years later, I told the school therapist about the hell I lived, about the abuse. Help me? She called the police, who threatened to arrest me for statutory rape because I was a year older than Joe. The officer said if I got pregnant, he would personally arrest me. When my father felt I was crazy because I was 15 and liked opera, oh, he got me help all right. He had me see a third therapist, asked if they could fix me to get the opera out of me. He sent me home with a clean bill of health. Help me? They don't help. Therapists don't help. They didn't. They could, William insisted. They had the chance in their hands. I told them every horror I lived, and they branded me a liar and threw it out. They threatened to charge me with rape. They saw nothing wrong with me. I trust no one, least of all therapists. No one can help me. This is different, William said. Do you want to hear this story or not?